Attorney General of the United States, the Honorable Robert F. Kennedy. Mr. Kennedy.
Recently, the President said that this is a time of national maturity and understanding, and willingness to face issues as they are, not as we would like them to be. If we can be purposeful, if we can face up to our risks and live by our word, if we can do our duty, undeterred by fanatics and frenzy at home or abroad, then surely peace and freedom can prevail. It is one of the strengths of vigorous, free people that they can look their enemy full in the face. Thus we can and must understand all the tactics which the communists are using in their unrelenting attack upon freedom and against free men everywhere. They know, as we do, that the future belongs to youth, and for this reason they have sought to recruit, exploit, and manipulate young people throughout the whole world. The vigor and vitality of young people constitute a force of immense proportions. With understanding and with purpose, this force can accomplish immeasurable good. Misled and manipulated into destructive channels, this explosive force can create chaos. The narrator for this film is Lieutenant General Joseph F. Carroll, Chief of the Defense Intelligence Agency and a former special agent of the FBI. General Carroll draws on a wealth of experience with communism and its methods. General Carroll.
Speaking on September 6, Secretary of Defense Robert S. McNamara said, "There is nothing so sacred, friendship, integrity, church, or family, that it escapes the attention of the Soviet commissar or the communist bureaucrat." The communists are embarked on a worldwide campaign to capture and manipulate the vital force which youth represents. This campaign is now in progress and is in keeping with the Leninist principle which states that ultimately youth will decide the issue of the entire struggle. When he said this, Lenin knew that the communists would first have to extend their influence into the key centers of power in other nations if the communists were to achieve their main goal, to take over the world. And the communists have had more immediate targets than youth, but if they mean to make this takeover stick, if they are taking a long-term view, a primary concern must be youth. All this is nothing new. Aristotle stated it quite well more than 2,000 years ago. All who have meditated on the art of governing mankind have been convinced that the fate of empires depends upon the education of youth. Whatever your system, if you intend to make it the only one on the globe, you must make sure of the youth who will soon be in charge of it. In the next few minutes, you will see that the communists effectively use their growing capabilities to gain and wield control over young people. Naturally, they vary the methods to suit the time and place and country, but the essential ingredient is the same: to turn the high idealism, the universal yearning of youth for a better life and a better world, to their own communist advantage. How do they go about it? Let's take a look at some of the places where they are at work. In directing its own youth at home, the Soviet Union has a very broad choice of techniques. These extend all the way from rewards and incentives to imprisonment or even death. The essential element is control from the cradle to the grave. This has been tyranny's design for youth in the past, and this is precisely the Soviet design for its youth today. By the time children in the USSR reach school age, some have already had 3 or 4 years of conditioning in state-operated institutions. At 7, they become young pioneers, and the intensity of the control increases. In school and in the young pioneers, this indoctrination continues through the high school years. From the age of 15 to 28, the student, in order to get ahead, is obliged to become a member of the Komsomol, or Young Communist League. what with classes, indoctrination, work on state projects, and military service, the Komsomol member often puts in 14 hours a day. The purposes are to keep young people from family influences and to instill in them primary devotion to the state and the development of communist society. The same kind of thing, and even more extreme application of it, has been the order of the day in Red China under the commune system. Children are literally raised by the state. Everything they learn applies to how they can and must serve the state. This includes both academic studies and the practical vocational training as well as recreation, which is an integral part of the educational system. In addition to the Soviet system of education, it's important to every American to understand the substance of what is taught to young communists, because what they are taught comprises their outlook upon themselves, the world, the universe, and you. The foundation of this outlook is a concept called materialism. Just what does this mean? Well, it means, for instance, that individual man is an animal and nothing more. Oh, he's the most intelligent and resourceful of the animals, but he's still just an animal. Mentally, socially, he is what he has experienced. His convictions about right and wrong, mere cultural prejudices. His motives are primarily economic, the satisfaction of his material needs. Spiritually, nothing at all. There is no such thing. The communists didn't invent these notions, but they have made them the basis of their outlook on man and reality in general. And they try to cultivate this outlook in any country where they are at work, because it paves the way for them. Once you accept this materialistic viewpoint, it logically follows that individual human beings as such mean nothing. The interest of the state, the mass, becomes supreme. The end justifies the means. On such premises, the communists base their actions around the world. Let's move on to take a look at the techniques in use in a communist country outside the iron and bamboo curtains. The first and most familiar is mass appeal to the emotions. Less than 100 miles off our shores, Castro has made and continues to make massive efforts toward capturing the imagination and support of the young people of Cuba. A master at manipulating the emotions of a crowd, he uses many of the same totalitarian techniques made familiar by another man who had an uncanny way with a mob, Adolf Hitler. The mass meetings at night, the lights, the banners, the chanting. And finally, when the stage is set and all the props in place, the long harangues full of emotions by the man standing in the spotlight above the crowd. It's all familiar, and it is apparently still effective. For youth, especially youth, enthusiasms are intense and easily aroused. So far, we've examined techniques used by communists with regard to the youth of nations they control. What about their efforts to reach and to use the young people of the free nations, the uncommitted nations, and the new nations? There is a universal desire among young people everywhere for education. The hunger for learning in the nations which lack modern school systems is tremendous. The communists know this and have set out to make this hunger work for them. Scholarships and free transportation for students to universities in the communist bloc countries are part of this effort. Of course, communist indoctrination permeates only part of the so-called free instruction. Rather, the technique is more subtle, to get a sympathetic response from students who will become leaders in their home countries. With some students, it has the desired effect. But it has not all been roses for this particular communist effort. A considerable number of students rapidly became disillusioned under communist tutelage. African students, for example, found instead of the widely advertised brotherhood and friendship a brand of racial segregation and discrimination, which was all the more galling because the communists condemned it even while they practiced it. The communist youth festivals are another technique worth considering. Every 2 years since 1947, they invited the youth of other countries to take part in these gatherings, which they advertise as non-political. What actually occurs is this. The thousands of young people present are subjected to concentrated doses of enthusiasm for the programs of Communist Front movements. All this, remember, under the banner of peace and friendship. The air of celebration is carefully organized. The demonstrations all designed to stimulate youth to believe in the growing affluence and power of the communist world. The young participants themselves are supposed to respond with applause, thus providing what appears to be broadly based vocal support for Soviet foreign policy slogans. This kind of a show, including transportation and housing for guests, runs into millions of dollars. It is not unreasonable to believe that the communists are not going to put out that kind of money for something which does nothing to serve their interests. The youth festivals, as any promotion or publicity man could tell you, are advertising on a grand scale, an investment in propaganda. And many students from non-communist countries, merely by attending, have helped to give these affairs whatever success they have enjoyed. The festivals, too, however, have had their bad moments. At the 1959 festival in Vienna, a very interesting thing happened. You'll remember that at the time, the ruthless suppression of the people of Tibet was fresh in the thinking of the world. The communists made every effort to make sure that such subjects as Hungary and Tibet were not brought up at the festival. After all, this was a meeting in the name of peace and friendship. Such considerations had no place here. But some young visitors didn't agree. They made a poster which bore the inscription, "Remember Tibet," and smuggled it into the festival parade. When they brought it into the open, they were beaten by communists. In this context, the youth festival ballyhoo about free exchange of ideas begins to take on a peculiar odor. But university scholarships and youth festivals are only part of the communist campaign to influence and use the youth of the world, and the most obvious part. More hidden and subtle are the techniques they use in areas wherever there is unrest or a potential for unrest. And there is no place on the globe, with perhaps the exception of the polar ice caps and the bottom of the seas, where there is not today the potential for unrest. Today, poverty and comfort often exist side by side. A great many people in the world don't have enough to eat or a decent place to live or the education to get either. But increasingly, they know that better things exist. They want a better life, and no one can blame them. This produces a climate of unrest which the communists purposely exploit wherever they can. In recent years, we have seen much of violent unrest south of the border in the Western Hemisphere. Latin America, feeling the effects of the vast changes which technology has brought to life on our planet, has been the scene of violent protest against poverty, ignorance, and the exploitation of both. This has been a fertile ground for communist agitation. To be specific as to methods, the communists, frequently uninvited, join forces with opposition groups. They send skilled agitators to magnify unrest. They insinuate their own political slogans to focus the emotional atmosphere on issues or symbols of their choosing. An example of this was seen in Venezuela in 1958. Although most of the Venezuelans were airing their grievances against a previous dictatorial government, the communists took advantage of the vice president's goodwill mission to exploit the fact that the United States had maintained normal relations with that government. The United States was following a policy of non-intervention in the internal affairs of other American nations, but the communists depicted us as an imperialist, rich, and uncaring nation. They touched off the bitterness that led to violence. The results you have seen. A similar technique was used in Japan, even though the issues were different. Here, the opposition Socialist Party, advocating a neutralist foreign policy, launched demonstrations against the conservative government for signing a revised mutual defense pact with the U.S. The communists joined the effort and helped whip up hysteria, which ultimately resulted in canceling President Eisenhower's scheduled visit to Japan in June 1960. As elsewhere, the communists represented only a minority in the total assembly of demonstrators. But communist participation is a force to be reckoned with. The communists know what they want to achieve and how to go about it. They aim at inflaming passions and turning peaceful protests into disorder. In their own eyes, the communists succeed well where their actions not only make the United States a scapegoat, but where local police authorities are compelled to use force against non-communist demonstrators. This makes local governments look like a tool of so-called capitalist oppression. Right here at home, we have seen this same communist tactic of seizing any opportunity to degrade the institutions of law and the forces of justice. This is the City Hall of San Francisco, where the Committee on Un-American Activities of the House of Representatives convened in May of 1960. The situation was ripe for trouble and tailor-made for communist exploitation. Opposition to committee hearings had developed, particularly among students the previous year, over an inquiry into alleged communist activities of educators in Northern California. The committee's 1960 hearings were not directed at communist efforts to influence education, but the communists skillfully planted the idea that the 1960 hearings were aimed basically at teachers. The students' youthful exuberance made the demonstration potentially explosive and simplified the communist job of arousing them to action. Of course, the students and other citizens on hand had a right to express their opposition. The Constitution guarantees this right as long as they express their opposition in orderly ways and within the framework of the law of the land. But the communists do not want orderly demonstrations and use every trick in the book to turn peaceful protests into disorder. Experienced communists were on hand with a plan. Here you see a subpoenaed witness, Archie Brown, longshoreman and longtime communist, in a peaceful role distributing handbills. Now, watch and listen as you see and hear Archie Brown in an activist role, leading a group of witnesses, including Communist Party members, in a demonstration in the hearing room itself.
Open the door! Open the door! Open the door! Open the doors! What are you afraid of? Open the doors! Here comes the Goose Squad! This is Americanism! Watch this Americanism in action! Wow! Watch this Americanism in action! Watch this Americanism!
his objective is accomplished: disruption and violence requiring police intervention. The demonstrations were not confined to the hearing room, as we now see the staid hallways of City Hall rocked with a disturbance that got so loud that judges in courtrooms near the committee hearing room couldn't conduct court business. Agitators continued goading the crowd of young people into actions which were far beyond the limits of lawful and orderly demonstrations. The end result made headlines and grist for the communist propaganda mills. Among those arrested for their part in the appalling disorder which took place in San Francisco City Hall were some 62 young people. The students were later released by the judge, and rumors very quickly circulated that they had been unjustly arrested. This was not the reason for their release. The judge explained his dismissal of the charges by stating in his decision, "A protracted mass trial with 62 defendants and 16 attorneys would not only be costly from a monetary sense, but would play directly into the hands of those who create unrest and who do everything in their power to upset our democratic processes and way of life." He added that the defendants were, for the most part, clean-cut American college students who could well be haunted for the rest of their lives by the stigma which a conviction would attach to them. Note well, however, that in these disorderly demonstrations which occurred in San Francisco, you have observed communism in action. Now for infiltration in its classic form. How do the communists insinuate themselves legitimately into decent organizations and turn them into communist fronts? One of the basic techniques is extremely simple, and I'd like to show you how it works. This next bit of film is from an Armed Forces motion picture on communism made in 1950. The technique is still right up to date, however. It hasn't changed a bit. Of course, the communists who intend to gain control of a legitimate organization do not advertise their presence. As far as the others of the group are likely to know, they are no different from the rest, but they are different. They know what they want, and they have a plan. They arrive early, prepared to stay late. Once the proceedings get underway, they go to work to bog things down. They ask delaying technical questions about procedure, pretend not to understand, drag out the explanations, anything to delay the progress of the meetings. Their purpose is simply to delay and delay until the hour is late and a lot of the regular members have grown discouraged and gone home. Then they move, and from here on there are no delays in the meeting. Their small number is now enough to pass measures they favor and to elect communists to key positions in the organization. And so, another legitimate group becomes a communist front. Of course, that is a compressed and simplified version of the technique of infiltration and takeover. But it is an accurate illustration of the methods on which the communists work many variations. Before we add up the score on communist techniques with youth, there is yet another important area we must examine, perhaps the most revealing of all. This takes us to the satellite nations of Eastern Europe. In the belt from the Baltic to the Mediterranean and the Black Sea are old countries with deep roots in Western civilization. But many of these countries have been brought under the Red Banner. This is Hungary in 1956. The communist rulers installed by Soviet leaders have had a decade or more to direct youth in school, recreation, and state service. Of course, the methods are copied from Kremlin manuals. Indoctrination has been uneven, and sometimes it has failed altogether. When this occurs, the communist mask is torn away. The so-called communist wave of the future looks like a cesspool. For the watching youth of both the communist and the non-communist nations, the somber lesson is reprisal. the communists do not hesitate to apply all the force and brutality at their disposal to crush opposition and to bury dissent. Don't let the communists give you the impression they are more than human. They are not infallible, they make mistakes, and certainly they are not supermen. But they are intolerant of all criticism and unrestrained in repression. Now, a final bit of film to show that communist methods even include techniques destructive of that common characteristic of youth, the yearning for a better life and a better world. It takes us to the communist biggest sore spot in Europe, Berlin. At that meeting point of East and West, we can learn a corollary to the bitter communist lesson on Hungary. It is another communist technique for chaining youth under its control, the suppression of hope. For years, the youth of East Germany have received the full impact of an intensive indoctrination program. They have been taught and supposedly accepted that the communist world is the best of all possible worlds, that life under communism is the grand destiny of all men. I say supposedly accepted because thousands of the people of East Berlin and East Germany have used the divided city as an escape hatch. Some of them are older people who want relief from the pressures under which they live in the Soviet zone. But the majority of them, young people who, if the communists were as successful as they claim, should not be leaving the workers' paradise. The older people are a serious loss, but the communist plan for Eastern Germany vitally needs every young man and woman. The escape hatch, the alternative to life under communism, had to be closed physically to those who were uncooperative or thinking of defecting. Cut off from hope, young East Germans would have to resign themselves to making peace with the system. The message is clear. East Germans, stay home. The barrier was up, but a few young East Germans would continue to find ways of getting out at the risk and sometimes the loss of their lives. The job of guarding the barbed wire was given to East Germans, most of them young, whose uniform indicated that they, at least, had followed the communist pattern. But had they? Whom do you assign to guard the guards? So the barrier was made still more extensive. And it was reinforced as the wire fences became a solid wall. Whatever other purpose it is intended to serve, one thing is certain. They didn't have to build this wall because there was any great rush of people trying to get in to the communist zone. We have long known that the battle for the hearts and minds of men is joined. The Soviets and their communist minions are out to win that struggle, to gain control and wield power over men everywhere. Now we know even more. We know they want to perpetuate that power from generation to generation through the only method known to man, through the young people who will carry the torch when their elders pass it to them. The communist designs on youth are well established. They have set their sights on young people everywhere, behind the curtain, in new nations, in big nations, in small nations, in rich and poor nations. They have even set their sights on the youth of the United States. Will they succeed? Will their shots hit the target? Will the inducements, the rallies, the brute force drive and compel young people to follow the Pied Piper to the point of no return? The answer lies only in part with my generation. Most of it lies with young Americans as well as other free people everywhere. The communists must not succeed, and they will not succeed, if the youth of the free world learn their lessons well. Remember the subtle, the forceful, the potent communist techniques, their role in a direct control situation, the tried and true technique of mass emotional appeal, the exploitation of education, the more spectacular international masquerade before the youth of the world, the flaunting of law, order, and justice in our own country, their skillful infiltration technique, sharp reprisal when the mask is torn away, and finally, that double cross of young people, the suppression of hope. The target is youth.